There was a time when wanting to be alone meant nothing. It didn't raise questions. It didn't trigger concern. It wasn't something that needed to be explained. Silence was neutral. Solitude was normal. Being unavailable wasn't suspicious, but something changed. Today, choosing quiet feels like resistance. Preferring isolation is framed as avoidance. Stillness is often interpreted as dysfunction, and no one announced this shift. There was no law passed, no official declaration, no public debate. It just happened. Somewhere along the way, constant presence became the default expectation. If you're not visible, you're assumed to be disengaged. If you don't respond quickly, you're seen as distant. If you withdraw, people ask, "What's wrong?" Silence stopped being empty. It started being treated as a problem that needed a reason. This isn't about loneliness. This is about how the modern environment reacts to people who don't constantly signal availability. Look closely at everyday interactions, messages that demand immediate replies. Platforms designed to punish inactivity, work cultures that equate presence with productivity, social norms that frame solitude as something to fix. None of this feels aggressive on the surface. It's subtle, polite, wrapped in concern. But the signal is clear. Being unreachable, even briefly, is no longer neutral. And when a behavior stops being neutral, it becomes political. Not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that it starts affecting how you're perceived, trusted, and allowed to exist comfortably inside a system. Silence interrupts flow. It breaks feedback loops. It slows metrics. It creates gaps where nothing can be measured. And systems don't like gaps. They don't like spaces where behavior isn't being tracked, mirrored, or optimized. So silence is not as rest, but as withdrawal. Not as clarity, but as avoidance. Not as choice, but as something suspicious. This is the signal. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. A quiet pressure to stay available, to stay visible, to stay responsive. And if you don't, you start feeling like you're doing something wrong even when nothing is actually wrong. That feeling didn't come from nowhere. It's not personal. It's structural, and that's where the real story begins. When silence starts to feel wrong, most people assume the problem is internal. They ask themselves, why do I feel the need to disconnect? Why do I prefer being alone? Why does constant interaction drain me? But these reflex, blaming the self, is part of the pattern. Humans are deeply sensitive to social feedback. Long before algorithms, survival depended on reading signals of inclusion and exclusion. Being ignored once meant danger. Being disconnected meant vulnerability. Modern systems exploit that wiring. They don't need force. They don't need threats. They only need to gently associate silence with risk, and the mind fills in the rest. The pattern usually unfolds quietly. At first, you notice relief when you're alone. Clarity, energy returning. Your thoughts slowing into something coherent again. But almost immediately, a second layer appears. Guilt. A subtle sense that you're opting out, that you're missing something, that staying quiet requires justification. So you re-engage, not because you want to, but because friction builds when you don't. This is how behavior gets shaped. Not by commands, but by discomfort. Over time, the brain learns something dangerous. Silence equals social cost, and once that association forms, even peace starts to feel suspicious. People begin monitoring themselves. How long have I been offline? Should I respond so they don't think something's wrong? Is it weird that I don't want to go? The mind shifts from listening inward to managing perception outward. This is where the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. The more noise the environment produces, the more silence becomes necessary for clarity. But the more silence you seek, the more pressure you feel to justify it. So people compromise. They stay partially connected, half present, mentally elsewhere, but behaviorally compliant. The result isn't connection. It's constant, low-grade tension. A mind that never fully disengages. A nervous system that never fully resets. And the most effective part, no one tells you this is happening. It feels like a personal quirk, an introversion issue, a motivation problem, a personality trait, but across millions of people, the same pattern appears. The same exhaustion, the same craving for quiet, the same discomfort for choosing it. That's not coincidence. That's design, interacting with human psychology. Humans don't just adapt to environments. They internalize them. When a system rewards constant signaling, people begin to fear stillness. When attention is treated as currency, withdrawing attention feels like loss. And when silence disrupts flow, the human who chooses it becomes the anomaly. Not because silence is harmful, but because it doesn't feed the machine. This is the core tension. Silence restores the individual. Noise sustains the system, and the human mind gets caught in between. Solitude becomes something that needs explanation. But historically, silence was never a defect. It was where strategy formed, where pattern recognition emerged, where meaning was assembled without interference. What changed wasn't silence. What changed was the environment around it. Modern systems are optimized for continuity, not clarity. They reward participation over perception, reaction over reflection, presence over awareness. Silence does the opposite. It slows inputs, collapses noise, exposes patterns that constant motion hides. That's why it feels disruptive. Not to you, but to everything built around you. When enough people step back at once, the illusion weakens. Engagement drops, signals flatten. Narratives lose momentum. So silence must be reframed as dangerous. Not through force, but through discomfort. A quiet nudge. Stay connected. Don't disappear. Be part of the conversation. And most people comply, not because they agree, but because resistance feels heavier than participation. This is the real war. Not against speech, but against stillness. Not against expression, but against non-participation. And it's effective because it never announces itself. By the time you notice the exhaustion, you've already internalized the rule. Being quiet requires permission. Once that rule exists, the system no longer needs to act. You will. You'll explain yourself. Justify rest. Fill space you didn't want filled, and call it normal. But silence was never the absence of signal. It was the place where signals made sense, and a system that can't tolerate that is revealing more than it intends. Before you leave, take a second to check if you're resubscribed. Most people think they are. They usually aren't.